You know the kind of place. The ones they build on movie sets to represent the quintessential American dream. Postcard perfect. Every blade of grass in its place. Every house a testament to meticulous care. Every porch swing waiting for a quiet evening. It was a vision of suburban bliss, stretching out under a generous, blue sky. This was the dream, the promise, the reward we sought after 2 decades of a life lived on the very edge. When I retired from the Navy, after countless deployments that blurred into a relentless cycle of duty, danger, and distant loneliness, all Sarah and I craved was quiet. We wanted mundane. We yearned for the ordinary, the predictable rhythm of a life untainted by the shadows of combat. We found it here, or so we thought. This neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and manicured lawns, felt like an embrace after years of living in a world of stark, brutal contrasts. It was a haven, a fortress of normalcy where our son, Liam, could grow up without the constant anxiety of a parent being thousands of miles away, in harm's way. Here, the biggest drama was usually a misplaced package or a rogue sprinkler head, and for the most part, that's exactly what we got. Our house, nothing flashy, but it was ours. Every nail, every coat of paint, every flower in the garden, infused with the quiet pride of ownership and the deep satisfaction of finally putting down roots. It was the kind of place where neighbors genuinely waved, where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on, and where the rhythmic bounce of a basketball in the driveway was the soundtrack to a childhood. Liam, at 16, was thriving. He was a good kid, bright, athletic, respectful, not prone to trouble, not obsessed with screens like so many of his peers. His biggest passion, basketball, our driveway, freshly paved, was his court. He'd spend hours out there, working on his jump shot, his crossovers, the endless, almost meditative repetition of drills. Day in, day out, you'd hear that satisfying bounce, the soft swish of the net. It was a sound that, for me, symbolized peace. It was the sound of a normal life, a happy kid, a family finally whole. The quintessential American dream, right? Peaceful, perfect. Almost. See. Every perfect picture has a smudge. Every idyllic scene, a discordant note. And our particular smudge, our discordant note, came in the form of Karen. She lived directly across the street, in a house that seemed to define over-the-top maintenance. Her rose bushes were not just trimmed, they were sculpted, architectural wonders. Her lawn wasn't just green, it was a verdant, unblemished carpet, a golf course fairway in miniature. And her gaze, well, her gaze was everywhere. Karen was the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics, the unofficial enforcer of unspoken rules, and, as we would soon discover, a master manipulator of the HOA's bylaws. She was a woman who saw herself as the ultimate arbiter of taste and decorum for our entire block, perhaps even the entire development. At first, her intrusions were minor, almost imperceptible, a polite, but undeniably pointed comment delivered with a tight smile about Liam's basketball occasionally rolling onto her pristine sidewalk. Not that it ever actually left the driveway, but Karen possessed an impressive ability to preemptively find fault. Then came the passive-aggressive email to the entire HOA listserv, ostensibly from the concerned residents of Elmwood Drive, about the importance of quiet enjoyment during daylight hours, clearly aimed at Liam's early morning practice sessions, which, in reality, were never before 9 a.m. We'd brush it off. Just Karen being Karen. We'd tell Liam, don't let her bother you. We tried to teach him that in life, you encounter all sorts, and not everyone shares your joy. But these seemingly small intrusions were like tiny cracks in the perfectly manicured facade of our peaceful suburb. They hinted at something darker, something deeply unsettling beneath the surface. Karen wasn't just a busybody. She was someone who genuinely believed her personal preferences were the supreme law of the land, someone who craved absolute control over her environment and, by extension, everyone in it. She was someone who would find fault where there was none, simply because she felt entitled to define what was acceptable. She wasn't just living in the neighborhood, she was managing it, piece by piece, resident by resident, determined to bring everything and everyone into perfect, unquestioning alignment with her singular, unyielding vision, our free-spirited, basketball-loving son. He was about to become her next project, and Karen, with her perfectly coiffed hair and her razor-sharp sense of entitlement, had no idea she was about to pick a fight with a family whose definition of peace came with a 2-decade history of fighting for something far more significant and far more dangerous. The quiet perfection of our suburban dream was about to be shattered, not by some grand, external threat, but by the insidious, relentless tyranny of a woman who simply couldn't stand the sound of a bouncing basketball. The subtle hints of discontent soon gave way to a full-scale, bureaucratic siege. Karen wasn't satisfied with a tight smile and a polite word. She needed to impose her will through the only mechanism she understood: paperwork and perceived authority. It started with the deluge of HOA emails. They weren't coming from the legitimate Homeowners Association management company, mind you, but forwarded from Karen herself, almost always sent at inconvenient times early on a Saturday morning or late on a Tuesday night. Each email was cloaked in the stern, official language of manufactured governance, claiming to be on behalf of concerned residents, though we knew the only concerned resident was Karen. The initial target was excessive noise during quiet hours. The problem: Liam was practicing at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, a time universally accepted as fully awake and active. We even went out with a decibel meter. Liam's rhythmic dribble was barely louder than a dishwasher. But facts didn't matter to Karen, only her subjective experience of annoyance did. Then came the absurdity of Architectural Review Committee notifications. These were not official documents, but slick, multi-page pamphlets Karen had clearly designed herself. They claimed Liam's portable basketball hoop was a non-conforming structure that violated the sacred neighborhood aesthetic continuity. We received a 4-page document detailing acceptable colors, demanding the hoop be painted a specific shade of beige to blend harmoniously with the adjacent landscape. We tried to de-escalate. We truly did. Sarah, ever the diplomat, insisted we comply, hoping that simple obedience would deflate Karen's crusade. I begrudgingly bought the expensive, specialized HOA beige paint. Liam, bewildered but resilient, helped me paint his hoop. He started playing later in the day, after school, avoiding the early morning hours entirely. He even tried putting an old moving blanket behind the net to muffle the already minimal swish of a successful shot. He was trying, bless his heart, to navigate this absurd landscape of arbitrary rules, just to enjoy a simple, healthy game in his own driveway. But for Karen, compliance wasn't the objective. Control was the mission. Every small concession we made only seemed to embolden her, confirming her belief that she was indeed the reigning authority, the singular force of neighborhood law. If we yielded to the paint, she knew we would yield to silence. The harassment quickly became a psychological operation designed to wear us down. Every time Liam stepped onto the driveway, there she was on her porch, phone held high, recording, documenting, judging. Liam wasn't just playing basketball. He was constantly performing under surveillance. His enthusiasm dimmed. His shots became tentative. He started looking over his shoulder, his pure, athletic joy replaced by a self-conscious dread. The stack of unofficial violation notices grew thicker on our kitchen counter, chronicling every perceived sign: ball bounce frequency to high, inappropriate use of recreational equipment, disruption of quiet enjoyment. Sarah was spending hours on the phone with the actual, legitimate HOA management company. They were sympathetic, professional, but ultimately helpless against Karen's relentless, weaponized bureaucracy. She files more complaints than anyone else combined, the HOA manager confessed to Sarah, her voice weary. She documents everything with timestamps and photographs. We are legally obligated to address every single one, even if they are patently frivolous. We realized the chilling truth. Karen didn't want Liam to comply with the rules. She wanted him to stop playing entirely. She wanted his wholesome presence gone. This wasn't about rules or property values. It was about her imposing her suffocating will, her twisted definition of peace, on our family. It was psychological warfare, designed with malicious precision to make us surrender our personal enjoyment of our home to her imagined authority. The toll was immense. I, a man who had faced literal combat zones with unwavering focus, was being defeated by a stack of brightly colored, nonsensical HOA pamphlets. The constant stress was palpable. We were losing sleep. Our family dinners were consumed by exasperated discussions of our latest infraction report. And worst of all, we were watching the light go out of our son's eyes. His safe space, our home, was no longer safe. The ultimate humiliation came when she escalated from paper to physical interference. We'd find small, discreet orange cones placed at the exact center of our driveway, marked with little handwritten notes. Noise buffer zone, please respect. She once even called a towing company on a friend's car that was parked in front of our house for a few hours while they visited, citing an obscure, non-existent 4-hour maximum suburban guest parking rule. Luckily, the tow truck driver was sensible enough to call the police first, who quickly shut down Karen's attempt at public shaming. But the message was clear. There was no boundary she wouldn't cross, no line she wouldn't obliterate. We were spending thousands on Marcus, my lawyer, just to send polite legal letters that Karen simply ignored or met with retaliatory, nonsensical counter-complaints. The legal system, designed for deliberation and due process, was too slow, too expensive, and utterly incapable of dealing with this unique blend of relentless pettiness and entitlement. Karen had found the system's Achilles heel, and she was pressing it with all her might. We realized the only thing that would stop her was a force she could not file a complaint against, a presence she could not delegitimize with a clipboard and a camera. Our attempt at quiet compliance was an abject failure. The time for diplomacy, for legal niceties, was rapidly running out. We were trapped in a cycle of harassment, and the only path out, we slowly began to understand, lay outside the HOA's bylaws and the slow grind of the civil courts. We were retired military. We knew how to defend a perimeter when the forward lines failed, and Karen, with her relentless campaign of suburban terror, was about to find out exactly what happens when you mistake a place of peace for a place of weakness. The endless torrent of HOA emails, the frivolous violation notices, the aggressive positioning of her car, those were the paper cuts. They were the bureaucratic weapons of choice for entitled people everywhere. They were infuriating, costly, and exhausting, but they were still fought on the battlefield of civil procedure. We tried to treat it like a bad faith game of suburban politics, one we could eventually win with enough documentation and legal costs, but then Karen crossed the only line that truly matters. She turned her obsession from property aesthetics to a direct, personal attack on my son's happiness and our family's sanctity. It was Liam's 17th birthday. Not a massive bash, just a few close friends over for an evening of grilled burgers, cake, and some low-key backyard games. We had the music on, low, strictly confined to the interior of the house. We took every precaution, operating under the heavy shadow of Karen's constant surveillance, trying desperately to provide Liam with one evening free from the anxiety she had engineered. It was supposed to be a moment of simple, wholesome teenage celebration, a necessary respite from the absurd war she was waging. The kids were laughing, sharing stories, enjoying the rare, unburdened moment. And then, there she was. I caught her movement out of the corner of my eye. She was hovering over her 6-foot privacy fence, not just peering, but actively filming with her smartphone, held high above her head to capture the entire scene. She was documenting a private family celebration as if it were a public disturbance or a dangerous criminal enterprise. The camera's focus was not on our overgrown weeds or the color of the basketball hoop. It was pointed directly at the kids, at the birthday cake, at Liam's face. She was gathering ammunition for the next round of her harassment campaign, turning a moment of joy into a piece of manufactured evidence. Liam saw her, too. He was mid-sentence, talking animatedly to a friend. When he looked up, the light in his eyes, that bright, resilient spark that I loved, immediately dimmed. His face crumpled into a devastating mix of confusion, deep hurt, and resignation. He didn't even need to ask. He understood. Why is she doing this, Dad? His silence seemed to scream, "Why won't she just let me live?" It was no longer about noise ordinances or the aesthetic continuity of her neighborhood. It was about personal, malicious harassment. It was a calculated, deliberate invasion of our privacy, an attempt to poison a pure moment of family joy. The sight of my son's spirit being crushed by this woman's entitlement ignited a visceral, cold fury in my gut, the kind of protective rage that a father, especially one trained to defend, cannot contain. That was it. The line was not just crossed, it was savagely ripped apart. I knew then that legal letters and diplomatic compliance were utterly useless. Karen was not acting from a place of reason or law. She was acting from a place of pure, narcissistic control. I excused myself from the table and walked straight out of the back door. My pace was measured, my movements calm, but every muscle in my body was coiled tight. I walked right up to the fence line that separated our properties. The only thing separating us was 6 feet of wood and a vast, immeasurable gulf of character. She saw me coming, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a hint of fear, on her usually unshakable face. She quickly lowered her phone, realizing she was no longer in the privacy of her window. My voice was low, controlled, the kind of dangerously quiet tone that I used only when the stakes were existential. It wasn't the voice of a frustrated neighbor. It was the measured command of a veteran operator. Every word was chosen, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion, making them impossible to dismiss. "Karen," I said, leaning close to the fence, making sure my words were clear and unmistakable, "you have filed every possible fraudulent complaint. You have harassed my wife, and now you are filming my minor son's private birthday party on my private property." I paused, letting the severity of that sink in. That is harassment. That is not being a concerned neighbor. That is a personal attack, and I am warning you, as clearly as I possibly can. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of decades of learned authority. "You stop it. You seize all documentation, all contact, and all surveillance of my family and my son. You leave us completely alone." I pointed a firm, steady finger, not at her, but toward the house, emphasizing the sanctity of our home. "I am a retired military officer. I know how to document. I know how to prosecute, and I know how to protect my perimeter. This is your final warning. If you file one more complaint, or if you make one more move that targets my son, there will be consequences you will not like. Consequences that no HOA committee or civil court will be able to undo." Her face, usually so composed and judgmental, flickered. I saw a mix of surprise, fear, and a hardening, vindictive anger. She retreated instantly, disappearing behind her fence without uttering a single word. I knew I had rattled her. I had spoken in a language of absolute, non-negotiable authority that she hadn't expected from a suburban homeowner. But I also knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that I hadn't stopped her. I had merely pushed her to the precipice. She was too arrogant, too consumed by her sense of entitlement, to back down now. My warning hadn't instilled fear. It had, I realized, sealed her resolve to strike back with the most devastating weapon she had left, the false authority of the state. I walked back to my porch, the joyful sounds of the party permanently ruined, replaced by the heavy silence of imminent conflict. The battle for Liam's right to play basketball was over. The war for our family's safety and peace was about to begin, and I knew, with the chilling certainty of a man who has faced real enemies, that her next move would be one of maximum, devastating malice. The arrival of my friends, my very quiet, very specialized friends, could not have been more perfectly timed. The air was still thick with the residue of my confrontation with Karen. The silence was not peaceful. It was a tense pause, the moment after the safety is clicked off. I knew she was planning her retaliation, her ultimate move to assert her tyrannical HOA will over my family. I had delivered my final, non-negotiable warning, and now I was waiting for the inevitable blowback. But then, an unexpected and entirely welcome support arrived. A few days after my fence line ultimatum, some old friends pulled up to the curb. Not exactly visiting in the sense of a casual neighborhood drop-in, more like taking a highly specialized, necessary detour. There were 3 of them: Matt, Ben, and Rico, my teammates, my brothers in arms, former Navy SEALs. Just like me, they weren't in uniform. Of course, they were in practical civilian clothes, blending into the suburban landscape as much as 3 large, intensely focused men could. They moved with a quiet, efficient economy of motion that instantly set them apart. There was a coiled readiness in their posture, a lack of wasted movement that screamed professional to anyone who knew what they were looking at. They drove their own vehicles in marked, slightly rugged SUVs, vehicles built for utility and discretion, not for pristine suburban curb appeal. They greeted me with that particular SEAL handshake, firm, direct, and freighted with decades of shared danger and unwavering trust. It was a silent language, a mutual assurance that in this fight, whatever it was, we were together. Liam, watching from the driveway, immediately sensed the difference. He watched their precise, synchronized movements as they unloaded their gear. "Who are they, Dad?" he asked, his curiosity overriding his usual teenage reserve. "They single quotes different." I just offered a small, knowing smile. "Old work buddies, son. Very old work buddies. They're just making a stopover before their next contract." They settled in seamlessly, but their presence instantly altered the equilibrium of the entire street. These weren't men who were merely visiting. They were men who were establishing a secure perimeter. They moved around my property, not lounging, but subtly observing. They helped me with yard work, but their movements were efficient, their gaze constantly sweeping the street and the houses, cataloging everything. Hedges were trimmed with geometric precision. Tools were put away in tactical order. Simple domestic tasks were executed with the quiet competence of a well-oiled machine. And Karen, oh, she noticed, immediately. The woman who had been practically glued to her window and her camera every time Liam touched a basketball was now conspicuously invisible. Her blinds, usually open to document our every infraction, remained tightly closed. You could sense her confusion, her perturbation, radiating from across the street. These weren't the noisy teenagers or unruly homeowners she was used to manipulating and delegitimizing. These were 3 large, quiet men who radiated a palpable, unshakable competence. They were a challenge she could not neutralize with an HOA email or a false fine. She had never encountered a force she couldn't dismiss as petty or unprofessional. She would sneak glances, though. We'd catch the occasional, swift movement behind the thin lace curtain of her bay window. Her usual air of smug superiority was replaced by a visible, unsettling unease. She was trying to place them, to find their weakness, to determine their jurisdiction over her life, their presence alone silent, watchful, and emanating years of disciplined authority was the most effective defensive measure I could have ever conceived. It was a clear, unspoken message. The perimeter is locked down. The legal maneuvering is over. Cross this line again, and you will meet a response that is decisive and uncompromising. I knew Karen was still plotting, still simmering with rage over my previous warning. But now, she wasn't just plotting against a retired man and his teenage son. She was plotting under the silent, professional surveillance of 3 highly trained, quietly formidable men. The air was thick with the strange, uneasy calm of a pre-mission staging area. We were waiting for her move, prepared to meet her suburban escalation with a response she would never, ever anticipate. The quiet tension we had maintained for days was about to be broken by a spectacular, self-inflicted explosion. We were waiting for her move, and she delivered with maximum, reckless malice. Karen, infuriated by my final warning and intimidated by the presence of my friends, decided her only way to reassert dominance was to summon the ultimate authority, the police. I was in the garage with my teammates, Matt and Ben, when I heard her voice, not the usual shrill complaint, but a frantic, theatrical scream carrying across the street. "Yes, I need to report a dangerous disturbance. A reckless minor is creating a hazard, and there are suspicious, intimidating individuals on the property who are harassing me." She hadn't called the non-emergency line. She had called 911. She was throwing gasoline on a match. using the full weight of the state to enforce her personal, petty grudge, weaving a lie that endangered us all within minutes. The flashing red and blue lights painted our street, and the scream of the sirens announced the official arrival of the law. Karen was already on her lawn, practically vibrating with self-righteous triumph, pointing wildly at Liam and my house. "Officer, they're dangerous. They look like thugs, and they're intimidating the whole community," she shrieked. I walked out immediately to meet the lead officer, my hands relaxed, my voice calm. "Officers, I'm Jake Peterson. This is my property. This is a continuation of a neighborly dispute." She has escalated into a false police report. As I spoke, the air behind me thickened. Matt, Ben, and Rico emerged, moving with perfect, disciplined efficiency. They stood flanking me, absolutely still, their posture instantly shifting from casual civilian to focused security operator. They were not aggressive, but they were undeniably formidable. The lead officer, Officer Davies, turned to Karen, his face already skeptical. "Ma'am, what precisely is the dangerous situation?" Karen, making her final, career-ending mistake, pointed directly at my friends. "They are suspicious characters, officer. Look at them. Ask them what they're doing here. They're intimidating me." Davies' eyes followed her pointing finger. He looked at Matt, at Ben, at Rico. He saw the coiled strength, the unblinking, analytical stare. He knew me, a local, retired veteran. Then, his eyes flicked back to me, and I gave him the smallest, most imperceptible nod. The kind of nod that confirms a deeply specialized truth. The realization hit Officer Davies like a physical blow. His face went blank, then hardened into professional ice. He understood perfectly that Karen had just filed a false police report, recklessly wasting emergency resources and summoning officers to confront highly decorated, retired Navy SEALs, calling them suspicious thugs. His patience evaporated. He turned his back completely on me and my friends, focusing his entire, chilling authority on Karen. "Ma'am," he said, and the single word was absolute. "You filed a false 911 call involving claims of immediate danger. That is a serious offense. You are now being detained while we investigate the facts of your report." Karen's face, moments ago triumphant, instantly shattered into a picture of utter disbelief and humiliation. Her power, her HOA authority, her suburban tyranny, it had all evaporated. She had called 911 on my teen, but she hadn't expected the men standing with him to be the very standard of professional order she claimed to uphold. The reckoning was no longer a threat. It was a devastating reality. The moment Officer Davies realized he was dealing with a false report, one that recklessly endangered his officers and wasted emergency resources by calling harmless, highly decorated veterans suspicious thugs, Karen's power dissolved completely. He didn't waste another second on her complaints about a basketball. He pulled her aside, and his voice, though low, carried the undeniable weight of genuine legal authority. It was a voice that brooked no argument, no deflection, and no HOA maneuvering. I watched her face as he spoke, and the transformation was immediate and stunning. Her confident, entitled mask dissolved into a look of panicked, dawning horror. She tried to interrupt, to fall back on her script, sputtering, but the noise, the HOA rules. Davies simply shook his head, holding up his notepad. "Ma'am, you filed a false 911 call involving claims of immediate danger and intimidation. That's a criminal offense. I have 3 witnesses here, distinguished, retired military personnel, who can confirm that your actions constitute a documented, sustained pattern of harassment against a minor. This is no longer a neighbor dispute. You have wasted police resources, and I am filing a full report detailing your conduct and recommending charges. The threat of criminal prosecution, not a civil fine from the HOA, was the shockwave she couldn't deflect. She went completely silent, suddenly realizing she had brought down the entire structure of the state upon her own head. All because a teenager was playing basketball. The other officers, now fully briefed on the identity of the men standing on my driveway, handled the rest of the scene with professional urgency. They treated Karen with the cold, official detachment reserved for someone who has genuinely violated the public trust. The confrontation that she had engineered to humiliate me and my family had resulted in her own spectacular public shaming. The consequences for Karen extended far beyond the police report. Officer Davies' actions created the leverage the genuine HOA management company needed to finally act decisively against their most toxic member. The very next morning, a professional, no-nonsense woman, the legitimate HOA manager, whom Sarah had been talking to for months, arrived on the street. She didn't bother speaking to Karen first. She came directly to our house, and her apology was sincere, deep, and without qualification. She explained that Karen's documented pattern of harassment, culminating in the police report, was grounds for immediate and permanent removal from all HOA committees and volunteer positions. She has been neutralized. Mr. Peterson, the manager stated, her voice firm. Her privilege to file complaints has been suspended, pending a full board review, which, frankly, is a formality. The board is tired of funding her personal vendettas. You and your son will not hear from her again through official channels. Later that day, we watched Karen, looking utterly defeated and alone, systematically removing all of her unofficial, self-appointed signs from around the neighborhood. Her meticulously crafted facade of HOA authority crumbled into a pile of junk on her own curb. Her campaign of entitlement had finally been met with consequences that she could not appeal, manipulate, or filibuster. The ultimate irony was that the presence of three quiet, observant, and highly capable men who never filed a complaint, never raised their voices, and never initiated contact with her had achieved what months of due process and thousands of dollars in legal fees could not. They were the ultimate deterrent. They were the physical embodiment of the unshakable truth that a lie, no matter how loudly shrieked, cannot stand against the quiet authority of fact, training, and absolute solidarity. The air on our street, for the first time in nearly a year, was truly, genuinely peaceful. My teammates stayed for 2 more days, just long enough to ensure the message had truly sunk in. There were no more incidents, no more twitching curtains, no more hostile glares. The silence Karen had always demanded was finally here, but it was a true, natural peace, not the tense, forced quiet of surveillance. They didn't need to do anything else. Their presence alone was the enforcement, the ultimate deterrent. They were the physical embodiment of the code. We share a commitment to protect the perimeter, to defend the innocent, and to never tolerate injustice, regardless of whether that injustice wears a combat uniform or a perfectly ironed HOA blazer. Then, as quietly and efficiently as they had arrived, they prepared to depart. There was no grand ceremony, no loud farewells, just the firm, final handshakes, the silent language of men who had shared something profound. Always got your 6, Jake, Matt murmured, his eyes serious. Keep the kids safe. And with that, they were gone, pulling out of the neighborhood and disappearing back into the anonymity of their civilian lives. Ready for the next call, the next mission. Liam stood on the driveway, watching the SUVs drive away. He looked at me, his eyes full of a new kind of respect and understanding. They were protection, weren't they, Dad? He asked, his voice quiet. They were looking out for us, always. Son, I replied, putting a hand on his shoulder. That's the unspoken code. In the world, there are those who talk about rules, and there are those who enforce justice. And sometimes, you need the latter to handle the former. Our neighborhood finally reclaimed its peace. Liam plays basketball whenever he wants, the rhythmic dribble a welcome, normal sound a sound of freedom, not a source of dread. Karen keeps her blinds drawn. She stays inside. Her influence in the HOA has vanished. Her power, built on the shifting sands of paperwork and bluff, was utterly extinguished by the hard, unwavering reality of facing seasoned veterans who simply don't tolerate bullying. She made the mistake of targeting a family that understood true authority, not the manufactured kind. This story isn't just about an HOA Karen and a basketball hoop. It's about how quickly a sense of community can be poisoned when one person's entitlement is allowed to override the basic respect and freedom of others. It's about the failure of bureaucracy, where the legal system slow and costly can become a weapon used by the wealthy and malicious to harass the average homeowner. And finally, it's a powerful testament to the bonds of military service. My teammates, my brothers, didn't wear uniforms that day, but they brought with them an unwavering commitment to protect, to serve, and to defend the integrity of their comrades' home. They were the unexpected, overwhelming force of justice that Karen never saw coming. We secured the peace, but there was a cost. Months of stress, thousands in legal fees, and the knowledge that the world we live in is fragile. But the peace we gained, the quiet satisfaction of seeing Liam stand tall and confident in his own driveway, was absolutely priceless. In the end, we proved that while some people mistake the absence of conflict for weakness, when you mess with a veteran's family, you might just find that they still have a few very qualified friends willing to protect the perimeter.